in totality, how large was the whole redevelopment of everything that kind of came together, including the neighborhood that you were talking about, where you took down the two towers, plus rebuilding on the 2,000 parcels that you took back through eminent domain?
Yeah, so the initial modeling that I was there when during that time was just over 500 million. Today, with
Wow.
all the investments that they were able to bring back and commercial reinvestments, it's probably close to a billion at this point.
Wow.
It has brought tremendous economic, social, and housing opportunity to the area.
That is
Yeah.
just so amazing. And the amount of resources that you and your team was able to corral together. Wow, that's impressive. You just did a 500 million, almost $1 billion project. And now you went to Tulsa. Let's talk about Tulsa.
In the west section of the city, just across the bridge from the downtown area, sat one of our largest public housing developments. We took a similar approach as we did in Philadelphia to this neighborhood and created the River West community, a 7-phase, $280 million project that took just about 4 years to complete the transformation. Because some of the benefits that Tulsa had over Philadelphia, which are land was cheaper, access to financing, though the state gets far less low-income housing tax credits, they had an enormously generous philanthropic community that put tens of millions of dollars on the table to best leverage and move with urgency to rebuilding that community. Because as we built out the first phases of the site, we started to see household incomes rise, educational attendance rise, see growth in employment.
Wow. So $280 million. And you talked about one of the largest public housing developments.
Mhm.
Was that a complete tear down? Did you have to do a
Yes.
structural remodel? Wow.
Complete tear down to the core and then rebuilt it from the ground up. So, in Philadelphia, when we did the Norris Apartments choice neighborhoods, the return rate was maybe 60%. That's usually the cap for most of the 23 or so neighborhoods around the country who have choice neighborhoods grants to it. So getting to achieve 90% of the residents wanting to return, and that was the unique part of Tulsa, is that resident community really wanted to stay there and see it be rebuilt. And then they returned.
What is a target supply or housing that you're trying to build in San Jose?
Based on our regional housing needs assessment target, or otherwise referred to as our RHINA goals, we have to build 62,000 units by 2031.
Okay, welcome to the episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, I got Erik Soliván on the podcast today. I mean, he is the Director of Housing and Development at San Jose. And man, when I looked at his track record and I saw what he has done in Philadelphia and Tulsa and with their housing authorities and the amazing amount of progress they've made in those cities, I found a guy and I said, I need to go reach out to this guy. And I was telling Erik the story because most people ignore my messages, but I can tell what a great heart he has. But when he heard about what we're doing, he wanted to come on. He wanted to share what they're doing. And what better way for us to learn about how to solve affordable housing than from the guy in one of the most expensive cities in the country trying to solve it. So, Erik, welcome to the show today, man. How are you doing?
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate it. This is a great opportunity. I was really impressed by your story and just a chance to connect with you on this podcast and really just talk about this issue that's so near and dear to me. Definitely in the most expensive city in the country at this point, which is in and of itself its own challenge. But lots of opportunity here and just great partnerships, and happy to be a part of this today.
Man, so I can't wait to get into that. But man, let's back up a little bit. Who is Erik? And how did you even get into this world of affordable housing in the first place, man?
So that's a long story, going back almost, I would say, 20 years at this point in this career. So, my grandparents, moved to New York City, to Spanish Harlem, to the New York City Housing Authority on 122nd Street, called St. Edward's Projects. And that's where they grew up. That's where my parents grew up. And then my parents came to Philadelphia, and that's where I grew up in the public housing and supportive subsidized housing system as well. So this is a personal journey for me as well as a professional journey for me. And as I grew up in Philadelphia and spent my time in schools in the city as well as in the suburbs, and then eventually going to law school. And I started this work very much in state government, working for then Governor Rendell's. This goes back quite a number of years at this point. Now 3, 4 governors ago at this point, working in the Department of Community and Housing Development. Then after that, moved on to a firm called Public Financial Management. So did the private sector side, looking at housing bonds and housing initiatives and housing finance. Then went to work for the Philadelphia Housing Authority as one of the first executive vice presidents there, doing our big initiatives around choice neighborhoods and how do we find innovative strategies around financing the development of affordable housing. Then after that, went to Denver and then Tulsa and then now here in San Jose. And it's been quite a career tour, but always remembering just the roots where I came from in this work and where my parents very much saw the value and instilled that value of community and giving back. And so that's how I see this charge in public service that we have is how do you rebuild community? How do you expand opportunity? And where do you find the best and most effective and most impactful paths to transforming lives and creating new communities? And so that's very much what drives me to this work.
Man, Erik, I mean, just to see your career path growing where it has grown, I mean, your parents have and your family must have done a great job instilling just tremendous values with you. And one of the myths that I try to overcome on this podcast, Erik, is a lot of people think affordable housing is guns, drugs, drama, when in reality it's hardworking folks like our family that's just trying to put food on the table. So if I could just have you just tell us a little bit more about your family. I mean, what kind of people were they? I mean, you talked about the values that they showed you. Help me debunk some of these myths.
Yeah, absolutely. Affordable housing and particularly public housing has a lot of that past, but that is not where a lot of it is today. The historic towers in Cabrini Green that people know of in Chicago or in Philadelphia was the Blumberg Towers, or in New York City, any number of towers in challenged neighborhoods. That history of public housing, it's not its current trajectory, as there's been a fundamental shift in how do we look at the provision of affordable housing, of public housing, of subsidized housing, towards creating integrated communities through mixed income development is what has occurred for the last 25 years. As a part of this transition in my career, to see that change from growing from densely populated public housing that had that history of crime and negative impact to what it is today and what has grown into, which is substantial positive impacts on the change occurring in communities. And part of those tools, like choice neighborhoods, so I've done now 4 choice neighborhoods in my career, 2 in Philadelphia and 2 in the city of Tulsa. The city of Philadelphia probably has the largest choice neighborhoods in the country in terms of its scale and impact in and around the Blumberg Towers, which have all been taken down before I left, and the rebuild of that entire Sharswood community. It is a fantastic story. The president and CEO there, Kelvin Jeremiah, who's still there from my days, they have brought a positive revitalization of a mixed income community. And that's what affordable housing is today. And we did the same thing in Tulsa when we rebuilt a community in the west part of the town. And we've done that here in San Jose, where we're making investments and bringing both affordable units and market rate units together. So those old ideas, those old myths of what public housing used to be, sure, there's always examples of it here and there. But the trajectory over the last 25 years has been towards integrated mixed income communities that bring value, support, opportunity, jobs to the residents who were there. And my parents didn't get to experience that growing up, but that is definitely what it is today.
And I can't help but just reiterate to the audience that, man, you were a kid that grew up in public housing, and look at the impact that you're making today. Not just addressing one problem in one small city, but Philadelphia, Tulsa, some of the major cities in America. So let's kind of back up a little bit. We talked a little bit about Philadelphia. I want to follow that story.
Mhm.
When you were in Philadelphia, I mean, what was the problem that they were facing? I think you hinted at it, but what was the problem that they were facing, and how did you approach applying, whether it's a structured framework or a consistent way of looking at these problems? Because right now there might be another city or a county that's
Yeah.
listening to this podcast and wondering, hey, how do I even start? What was the problem in Philadelphia, and how did you start solving that problem?
Yeah. So Philadelphia primarily had three challenges, right? One, it is a historically old city and has gone through so many changes, going back to 1776, right? Before the country was founded. It's just a city that grew, went through cycles of boom and bust and revitalization and deconcentration and repopulation. And it just has that history with it and all of its legacy costs associated, as well as its fragmentation and redlining that occurred to various communities. That's one lane. Its second change or challenge that occurred was that as it developed into the modern city that it is today, communities that were disenfranchised from accessing that opportunity got concentrated in particular neighborhoods. And then the third challenge was as we developed up community organizations, as the housing authority came in to its development phase, a lot of the prior development work, instead of integrating and keeping residents within these communities, primarily through projects like Hope 6, which is an old HUD project where we demolished big swaths of subsidized housing, rebuilt mixed income housing, including market rate housing, but never brought the residents back. That fragmentation further a lot of the challenges within the city. So with those three challenges that the city has, sort of legacy issues, fragmented communities, and then furthered by solidifying and limiting that access to opportunity of good jobs and good schools, part of what we looked at from the housing authority perspective and in working with the city at that point is how do we address all that through the creation of mixed income communities, through smart investments and acquisitions in real estate, and through unique ways of financing a community-wide redevelopment to address each of those issues, to instead bring together a historic community with new housing stock, bring together a historic community that maintains residents who are there and brings new residents who are there, and to rebuild a community that created natural, organic, as well as intentionally created connections to opportunity, to jobs, and to good education. And that's how we approach that problem. And so the Sharsworth Bloomberg is just a fantastic story of a new high school, job opportunities and training, mixed income, market rate, and home ownership and rental. It was a community basically rebuilt to meet all of the historic challenges of the city. And so that same approach, thinking through this strategy for execution on our work with communities, that has stuck with me throughout my career. And we did the same thing as we went into Tulsa and went into the West Tulsa community there, just across the bridge, a disenfranchised community, and did
Eric,
a similar work. Yeah.
Eric, let me dive a little bit deeper into Philadelphia because it's such a big project.
Yeah.
I don't want to discount the amount of
Mhm.
effort that went into it because, I mean, tactically speaking, it's a chicken and egg question, right?
Yeah.
Did you look for the financing first? You talked about Choice Neighbors. I'm assuming that was another big grant or
Mhm.
subsidized funding. Do you look for the land first? Do you look for the financing first? Do you look for community support first? How might someone try to tackle that problem sequentially? I guess is a better way of asking
Yeah,
it.
so that's a good question. And I think part of our approach was first identifying what community was sat at the intersection of all those challenges, was at risk of gentrification. Therefore, we knew there was investment coming, which created a stream of financing opportunities, had some of that historic legacy of old housing stock that probably needed to be demolished. And in fact, a lot of it was. We eminent domained over 2,000 parcels of abandoned homes and vacant lands just in the
2000.
targeted over 2,000.
Wow.
We did a lot of great work to kind of revitalize it. And then third, seeing the push from the center city district to the south, from the growth of the universities to the west, from the changing communities to the north, this neighborhood, Charlottesville Bloomberg area, presented a tremendous opportunity to solve those three challenges that the city historically faced just within this neighborhood. And so it's a mixture of seeing the financing opportunities, seeing the land opportunities, and then seeing the neighborhood residents who had an interest in bringing back their community and commitment to what is now over a decade-long process towards revitalization.
Wow. I mean, that's a huge project in of itself. I mean, I'm not even sure what number I want to ask for, but I'm just curious, like
Sure.
in totality, how large was the whole redevelopment of everything that kind of came together, including the neighborhood that you were talking about, where you took down the two towers, plus rebuilding on the 2,000 parcels that you took back through eminent domain? I mean, I'm really interested. And it's okay if you don't know it off the top of your head. I'm just really curious.
Yeah, so the initial modeling, that I was there when during that time was just over 500 million. Today, with all the investments that they were able to bring back and commercial reinvestment, it's probably close to $1 billion at this point. Kelvin Jeremiah, again, led a lot of this work. Great story about the new community that I think it was the Philadelphia Inquirer had did just a couple of months ago. It has brought tremendous economic, social, and housing opportunity to the area.
And I think not only did that debunk the myth about what affordable housing is, it highlights the tremendous amount of investment that you can see, right? This isn't something that's magic number that went somewhere and someone can't track where it went. This is something that you can see. And that is just so amazing. And the amount of resources that you and your team was able to corral together, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about Tulsa. What you just did a $500 million, almost $1 billion project, and now you went to Tulsa. And what was the problem there? How did it differ from Philadelphia?
So Tulsa had its own kind of very similar in its challenge. It needed more affordable housing. However, it had its own unique presentation of the challenges. Tulsa, still an old city, goes back to its historic roots from when that was part of the landing point from the Trail of Tears. And the way in which we took Native Americans in this city and moved them south, in this country, and moved them south to Oklahoma, Tulsa was one of those landing places. So it had a deep connection to our Native American roots, to indigenous populations. So as the city grew over time, by the 1900s, it had a prospering African American community that sat in an area of the city called Greenwood. In 1921, it experienced what was later come out. The story didn't come out until about the 1960s. One of the most horrific massacres of the African American community in that area. And it was referred to before as the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. But there was not a race massacre. What there was a complete annihilation of a community. And that birthed a new city from that experience where the African American population went north, where the majority white population went south, where the Hispanic and immigrant communities went west. And in the west section of the city, just across the bridge from the downtown area, sat one of our largest public housing developments. And we took a similar approach as we did in Philadelphia to this neighborhood and created the River West community, a 7-phase, $280 million project that took just about 4 years to complete the transformation. Because some of the benefits that Tulsa had over Philadelphia, which are land was cheaper, access to financing, though the state gets far less low-income housing tax credits, they had an enormously generous philanthropic community that put tens of millions of dollars on the table to best leverage and move with urgency to rebuilding that community. And third, the neighborhood wanted and welcomed the change. Because as we built out the first phases of the site, we started to see household incomes rise, educational attendance rise, see growth in employment. And by the time we wrapped up the 6th phase, just before I left, you experienced a completely transformed community that was both mixed income, because we did a lot, it's about 100 market rate units that provided access to jobs and opportunity to the residents who were there, who all got the right to return to the units, and reconnected that neighborhood to the economic success that Tulsa was experiencing.
Wow. So $280 million. And you talked about one of the largest public housing developments. Was that a complete teardown? Did you have to do a
Yes.
structural remodel? Wow.
Complete teardown to the core and then rebuilt it from the ground up.
I mean, that could sound like a logistical nightmare. Did you have to displace a lot of residents and move them elsewhere while you had to do it?
So that project, and one of its, again, great benefits, because the Tulsa rental market was so small that coming back with rental units, particularly with market rate units, there was an over 90% return rate, which is unlike the majority of choice neighborhoods. In Philadelphia, we did not, when we did the Norris Apartments choice neighborhoods, the return rate was maybe 60%. That's usually the cap for most of the 23 or so neighborhoods around the country who have choice neighborhoods grants to it. So getting to achieve 90% of the residents wanting to return, and that was the unique part of Tulsa, is that resident community really wanted to stay there and see it be rebuilt. And then they returned.
Wow. I mean, that's just a sign of tremendous buy-in from the community, because they all love what you did and your team did to bring it all together and completely transform the city. And now you see the pride of residency from all the residents. And that's so cool. Now, I want to ask one more question. You talk a lot about mixed income, right? In your experience, and I kind of want to lead into what have you seen that works and what doesn't work. Why do you prefer the mixed income approach versus like 100% affordable units? Can you shed some light on that and share some wisdom with the audience today on what works and what doesn't work based on your experience?
Yeah, and to your question before, when you think about historic public housing, right, that myth, crime-ridden, drug-ridden, lack of opportunity, the reason why that myth existed was because when we originally started creating public housing in this country, and it goes back to 1937, when the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, was first created. Actually, it was created in 34. Then the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development was created in 37. And the initial charge to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in 1937 was to clear the slums. So they would demolish slums and rebuild public housing right on top of it. So when you look at cities across the country, particularly older cities like Philadelphia and Tulsa and even here in San Jose, you see this concentration of public housing in our most disenfranchised neighborhoods. And that is where a lot of that myth and belief of what public housing used to be is, because we literally went into the areas that were the most disenfranchised, the most concentrations of poverty, and built housing on top of it and never actually brought opportunity. And that's been the biggest change in the evolution of the philosophy of approach as the housing department, the United States U.S. Housing Department, Housing and Urban Development, then created the Housing Choice Voucher Program in 1986, then created the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program in 1989 to then put forth a new strategy. Instead of concentrating poverty in one area, let's instead keep residents who are there and make a community of choice where those who can pay market rate are also going to live in the same area. And now we have a mixed income and a mixed vibrancy and diversity of families in one neighborhood.
I mean, that's just such a great explanation. Not only just tracking some of the history, but also showing how it evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, mixed income approach, it's working. It's evidence is right in the cities that you made a significant impact on. What doesn't work or what isn't effective anymore, in your opinion? Because I like to kind of talk about, hey, if affordable housing was so easy to solve for, then we wouldn't have this problem anymore, right? So maybe in your experience, like, what have you seen that hasn't been as effective, even when it had the right intentions, I want to say?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I'll talk a little bit about some of my experiences here in California and San Jose. With the evolution of the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the intention there was, how do we bring market forces to bear into the creation of more affordable, rent-restricted housing? And so the initial projects funded under LIHTC in many cities started modeling themselves along the lines of where public housing historically was. So instead of creating projects and housing in neighborhoods of opportunity, we started reconcentrating poverty. And so a shift was made policy wise with a program in the late 90s to instead flex that financing tool under Section 42 of the IRS tax code to better mesh and to integrate and to layer on top of alternative forms of private equity, of debt, of ways in which to better subsidize rents or not subsidize any rents, allow for low-income housing tax credit units to be in a building that's primarily market rate. So therefore, you're getting more affordable units, but it's further integrated into the communities. So as we've seen a lot of these HUD programs over the years evolve, the initial intent was good. We want to provide more affordable housing, but they started replicating some of the old challenges of that, which is reconcentrating poverty, race to the bottom in terms of finding the cheapest land and the cheapest materials and the cheapest build, instead of let's look at this as another tool for building community more globally.
And I love how you explained that, because the very tail end, you talked about developers or builders still look for the cheapest land. And instead of looking at examples that you have done in Philly and Tulsa, where you've created a mixed income, vibrant community, they kind of went backwards a little bit unintentionally, but because of how the programs or regulations were outlined and how competitive the LIHTC program is.
Yes.
I mean, it's just so competitive. You don't score all the points, you don't even get the LIHTC equity anymore.
Yep,
so what can you do?
So now I think here in California, that's a great bridge to here in San Jose. So San Jose, hyper competitive state for tax credits, even the non-competitive quote unquote tax credit that is the 4% on the state credit side, and the high cost of land, as well as the cost of construction and materials here, has made each project a complicated chase for resources. So as more and more municipalities with higher enforcement coming from the state of California on housing elements and implementing housing elements, as well as municipalities needing to get into the financing game more robustly in order to help projects mitigate the ever increasing costs within the state, we now have evolved into a space where the tax credit program in and of itself, though a great tool of the past, we now need an evolution to what is next. Because no longer is the tax credit program have capacity and speed and innovation in order to meet the current challenges and the headwinds against multifamily development to build new units in the state of California, particularly in San Jose, one of the most expensive cities in the country. And so now that historic program, we're now thinking about it differently. And instead seeing and identifying and partnering and innovating new ways of bringing equity and capital into our multifamily projects, whereby city funds truly get repositioned into gap financing, where we're changing our types of construction to lower per unit costs, where we're looking at pension funds, where we're looking at combined public-private partnerships to leverage asset values and monetization of existing portfolios to fill that capital stack through simpler sources that move a lot faster, because the speed at which we need to get to production. The tool of LIHTC, which was highly beneficial in Philadelphia and in Tulsa, is not as effective here. So we have to find ways to innovate that capital financing of each project.
And maybe it's just to educate folks, right? Sometimes folks don't understand. They hear about California. In the whole world of real estate, they're investing. Like people are like, oh, don't invest in California. Don't go there. It's so hard. Help educate the audience a little bit on what kind of improvements have you seen or sentiment that you've seen from local government officials that's much more open now and recognizing that this is a problem, that they're trying to be creative with you leading the charge and embracing that creativity. So what have you seen in terms of changes? Like, is the mindset towards development shifted at all?
And I think here there has been a shift, and that shift is sort of taking two paths. One, you have the more traditional, quote unquote, affordable developers who recognize that the tax credit chase, the bond cap, which is another challenge here, chase is not very efficient. And in order to get to quicker execution of these developments, because the longer you hold the land here in California, the more expensive the project gets. There's now a push towards how do we bring down cost? How do we look at alternative forms of construction in order to speed up the time of execution and look at other ways to bring debt and equity into the deals? That's one shift. The other shift is on the market rate side. As the demand for affordable units has skyrocketed, now you have market rate players who recognize the value of take my efficiencies gained in the creation of different types of units through alternative forms of construction, like stackable modular units that we have here in a project over on Stevens Creek Boulevard. Mix that with I can bring as a private sector equity to the table. Now I can avoid tax credits, avoid bond cap, go to the city, maybe get a little bit of per door subsidy. And I know I'm going to lease out 100% of my units at 80% AMI. And now that's an attractive product to our market rate folks. So you have this convergence of affordable developers, traditional affordable developers saying, where do I learn from the market rate folks who have alternative forms of financing and construction to create more mixed income communities. And then the market rate folks are saying, oh, there's high demand in the affordable space. I know I can get to 100% occupancy, write down a lower occupancy into my underwriting categories, and build out a decent, stable, affordable product that's going to get a high absorption rate, allow me to return capital to investors, allow me to flex and revolve my debt and equity structures into the next project, and contribute towards advancing the city. So both sides have seen just an evolution of this and converging into a single lane of mixed income, both affordable and market, both through financing and construction. And this innovation is where the city of San Jose is looking to lead. Because our tools of LIHTC, though it is, the workhorse of affordable housing, its pace and its timing is just a bit too slow, and we need to move faster given the high demand within the city.
I love how you have forces from all sides converging, using your wording a little bit, because now you're attacking supply from all fronts. I should have asked this question in the beginning. I mean, how many units, what is a target supply or housing that you're trying to build in San Jose?
So based on our regional housing needs assessment target, or otherwise referred to as our RHINA goals, we have to build 62,000 units by 2031. Which we're not going to meet, right? It's an enormous challenge, but we're going to make substantial progress towards that goal through this convergence of how we change and adapt in our affordable sector. How do we as government entities, us, the county, the Santa Clara County Housing Authority, where do we sync up our investments so we can make each project kind of move a little faster since they don't have to go to 3 doors to fill their capital stack? Where do we on the market rate side? How do we as a city reduce some of our taxes and fees to incentivize the development of more affordable units under our inclusionary housing to speed up that production and to encourage more on-site development? So we have mixed income communities coming from both lanes, from our market rate, including affordable, from our affordable, including market rate, because we're not having a lot of those restrictions from tax credits or other bond cap, and getting to this convergence that's going to hopefully catalyze more housing production in the city of San Jose.
Oh, that's just so well said, because now I'm thinking, I mean, with the amount of creativity that you're putting into the process, that's what's really eye-opening, because it shows that government isn't just staying put. You're not just saying, hey, the LIHTC program is what it is and nothing we can do about it. This is what's so impressive. And I'm so in love with how your team just communicates and works together, because I had brief interactions with your team and they're just so on it. And on top of that, they only say good things about you, and they wanted to attend this podcast live. So that shows a lot about your leadership here. And just want to give you and your team a quick shout out there. But
Thank
I
you,
mean,
Ken.
Erik, help us understand. So, when you talk about creativity, different ways of
Mhm.
financing and different sources, is the city actively trying to say, hey, is there some kind of soft subsidies that we can put together? Can we issue more municipal debt to kind of
Mhm.
subsidize the cost? What actual things are being looked at that are being considered that can attract more developers to kind of come into the market to get that supply up?
Yes, I mean, great question. There are three sort of primary strategies we're kind of looking at. The first is, as I kind of mentioned prior, and I'll talk a little bit about more detail. Where do we streamline the process for getting to building permits so you can start construction internally? With that streamlining, where do we look at ways to reduce fees and taxes that we impose on these projects so they're able to reduce carrying costs, reduce time to execution, reduce overall municipal tax liability and associated fees? And then within that same bucket, how do we ensure that we're structuring our affordability components and requirements in a way that allows for the projects to pencil, which is flexing the area median incomes that go into these inclusionary programs? The city council and mayor here, as well as a city manager here, has charged the department with thinking through new strategies that may not be able to tap into a huge amount of city resources like most municipalities. We have a bit of a fiscal challenge at the moment. So where do we take streamlining? Where do we take a waiving of fees and taxes owed? And where do we take our ability to provide process and to make more strategic investments with the limited funds we have to get to catalyzation? That's one area. The second area is then looking at our affordable pipeline. And as I kind of mentioned prior a bit before, streamlining all the government resources available to projects. So instead of a developer having to go to the city, to the county, to the housing authority, to the tax credit agency, to the bond agency, where do we say line that all up? So it's a much more fixed and execution, thereby reducing holding costs and getting to quicker execution. Then the third stream we're then looking at is truly around innovation. As I mentioned, we tax credits, bond cap, all that's a challenge. Where do we instead work with Destination Home and they have an innovation fund funded by Apple and Google? Where do we, and the Sobrato organization, where do we work with the Housing Accelerator Fund, who's got tech investments and wants to find ways to catalyze non-stick and brick or concrete construction and do alternative forms that can shorten the time for construction, thereby reducing debt and equity costs and interest rates? Where do we find those areas of innovation so the city can be part of the catalytic engine for moving production forward rather than sort of a passive player in how housing units of all types at all income levels across the housing continuum get into service?
Wow. I mean, that's impressive. All three ways. I mean, my ear just perked up as if you're a developer listening, I mean, hearing about the equivalent of a one-stop shop. So you don't have to go to the tax agent. You don't have to go to
Right.
everybody.
Mhm.
That's amazing. Because that's sometimes as a developer, you might have to end up playing quarterback for the city because one department might not be talking to the other department. And
Right.
sometimes that just blows people's mind. But it's not a fault. It's just sometimes there's different departments and they all have different responsibilities. So you
Yeah.
bring that together can solve such a big headache for some
Yeah.
developers out there.
Without
And then you talked about accessing funding. So I want to gear this conversation towards like, well, what does San Jose need right now? Are you looking for private investments from like a private equity fund, hedge fund that has interest in investing in real estate? You looking for folks with land that they want to participate in a joint venture or something like that? Tell us a little bit more about what does the city need, because I want the people listening to say, "Oh,
yeah.
I know someone that might want to participate in that," and I want to make sure I can get the ask and the wants that you and your team will need.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ken. I think about the thousands of units that we have entitled, means ready to build, and land that's already, zoned and passed all its initial requirements, but have not gotten out of the ground. So a tool there that we would need is big fund private equity to look at the thousands of units the city has ready to that's already been entitled and ready to go, but don't have the gap financing? How do we bring that private equity to bear, knowing that your absorption rates, your demand rates here are going to consume all of those new units? That's one area. The second area is, where do we open the landscape more to bring more developers who are looking to innovate in both their construction and their financing opportunities and need just a little bit of support from the city, from the county, from the housing authority, from whoever else, to make that project pencil and bring it forth. So new ideas, new ways of thinking. If you're an entrepreneur out there and you've got an idea for how to better finance multifamily real estate, both on the ownership side or the rental side, come talk to us, because we want to find a way to make projects work. And that is our driving charge at the moment. And then three, more of that philanthropic work, larger national philanthropies who want to get involved with the Innovation Fund, who want to get involved with the Housing Accelerator Fund, to see their dollar go towards the maximization of providing both extremely low income units to lower income families, all the way through to market rate, and truly build out inclusive neighborhoods and communities. San Jose is ready to work with you. So either of those three lanes, your market rate developer, your equity fund manager, your philanthropic fund who wants to make strategic investments, San Jose is a place to do business.
I mean, if you're a private equity fund or a hedge fund out there, you're looking to deploy capital, knowing that there's a portfolio of thousands of units already entitled, and you need to allocate your capital. I mean, this is a city that's welcoming private investment right now, which is almost unheard of and almost just not fitting the norm of your typical city or government. I mean, this is a city that's agile. This is a city that's thinking outside the box. And I'm just so impressed, Erik. Yeah. I'm so glad you came on this podcast. I remember telling you, man, I'm just like, I don't get to talk about affordable housing with my wife that much. So this is my jam right now. I mean, Erik, this is the question I ask everybody. I think we've touched upon this a little bit, but the genesis behind this question is, everybody, when I started this podcast 3 years ago, people kept saying, you can't solve for affordable housing. That's not possible. And I beg to differ, because I see what you have done in Philly and Tulsa, and now the openness and creativity that you're employing in San Jose. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just a matter of time before we collect all the pieces to the puzzle. And you're such a big piece of the puzzle right now, just sharing your ideas and sharing what has worked. Yeah. So, Erik, why do you think affordable housing, particularly the lack of supply of affordable housing, has just been so hard to solve for?
I think part of the challenge is that, after the financial collapse in 08, 09, that was caused by our real estate markets and the fundamental shift that occurred in this country from strong underwriting and strategic investments in housing development and purchasing of homes that met, a reasonable income scale, or in some case, just a reasonable income. We diverted away from that during 08, 09, and that collapsed our real estate market. That collapsed the construction market on both market rate and affordable. And all the while we're going through that recovery from 09 through to roughly 2012, 2015, clearing out foreclosures, looking at restrictions on financing. How do we get the credit default swap market under control? How do we find and better curtail and manage risk of our credit agencies, insurance agencies? We had to have a fundamental reset in the ways in which we think, do, and work through housing finance. And during that period from 09, after the financial crisis, to roughly 2020, 13, 14, the population still grew. And we still had more and more of our community members falling into poverty, falling on hard times, particularly all those who were laid off and lost jobs and opportunity during the Great Recession. And so that backlog of demand grew while the supply didn't. And so now, almost 15 years later, at this point. We are in 2025, so 10 years later from roughly 2014 to 2015, so about a decade later from the Great Recession. As population still grew, as demand for affordable units still grew, the supply not only stopped in 08, 09, it never got fully catalyzed to come back. So now in every city throughout the country, and I've literally worked coast to coast, from Philadelphia to Tulsa to San Jose, you're seeing the same challenges. We need more supply, we need more production, and the headwinds against supply and production, cost of land, cost of materials, cost of construction, is everywhere at different scales. Affordable unit in Tulsa cost about 300,000 to build. An affordable unit in San Jose, 900,000 to build. Philadelphia, somewhere in between, 6 to 700,000. Although those costs may vary, it's the same challenge because we just didn't produce enough housing in this country. We spent a good 5-6 years from 09 to roughly 14, 15, 2015, cleaning up the mess that occurred in our real estate and how we finance home ownership and overall markets. And we didn't build. And now we've got a building challenge. And we have a building challenge while costs are near record highs. And that is our fundamental challenge right now.
And that's tough. That's so
Mhm.
tough. And I really appreciate how much, when you talk about managing risk, I appreciate how much you and your city are proactively addressing, trying to lower some of the risk, lower the
Mhm.
entitlement risk, or for the developers to kind of come in and make it a little bit more friendly. So, Erik, this has been an amazing
Yeah.
conversation. I cannot thank you enough.
Yeah.
Without people like you, I would have never had the home I grew up in, man. So I'm so
Thank
grateful
you.
to know that there are people like you out there, like your team, that's doing the hard work, trying to get this message out there, but also showing and embracing change and creativity. You're definitely part of the solution, Erik.
I
Thank you
appreciate
so
that,
much.
Ken. And I thank you for this podcast. This is really important for folks to hear these messages. I looked back and listening to a bunch more over the last weekend. You're telling great stories. And this is a story that needs to be told and needs to be highlighted. And the workers in the houser communities, as we like to refer to ourselves, rarely get that opportunity to share the successes, to talk about the challenges, and to look into the future as to what are the chances for revitalization and rebirth. And so I appreciate you and the opportunity to come on here.
Man, I really want people that are listening today to understand you can make an impact in affordable housing. Doesn't matter what your role is. You don't have to be a real estate guru that owns 5,000 apartments out there. You don't need to
Mhm.
do that. Erik is a great example of how he dedicated his life to public service and how he's coming back and sharing all the information with people. And guess what? Erik has helped thousands of people live in these homes, and one of those kids is going to cure cancer one day. I'm
I hope
confident about
so.
it. I'm confident
Absolutely.
about it. And that's just such a fulfilling, I mean, that's just such a fulfilling feeling. And I feel so wholesome right now, Erik. I just feel so reinvigorated after
Mhm.
talking to you today to know that there are people in government that is working hard, that's trying to make a difference, that's doing the work, and have a great team behind them. I'm
Yeah.
so grateful, man. Hey, Erik, for people that want to follow you or reach out to your team to help with some of the things that you talked about, where can
Mhm.
people find you and get in touch with your team?
The best thing is cities, if you go to sanjoseca.gov/housing, you'll see our main website. I'm also kind of on LinkedIn as well, Erik L. Soliván, LinkedIn too. And I've got a great team here at the city of San Jose. Cupid Alexander, our deputy director, Banu San, our deputy director, my support team, Shelly Opsogel, and Jessica Reyes, a wonderful team to help execute this work. And for that, I'm quite fortunate. And all of our partners, at the Housing Authority of Santa Clara County, Office of Supportive Housing, Destination Home, the Housing Accelerator Fund, we've got a group of committed professionals who want to find ways to make your projects work. So we welcome your investments and reaching out to us.
Erik, this has been such an amazing, amazing conversation. I can't wait to bring you back on in like a year from now and just see what kind of progress you guys have made, because I think a lot of cities, a lot of counties are looking right now to other cities for leadership, for
Yeah.
guidance. And this is going to be another heck of a story for you to tell.
Great. Thank you, Ken. I appreciate it. All
All
right.
right. Thank
Talk
you
to you
very
soon.
much. And we
Bye
are
bye.
out.